Okay, we're going to resume. So now we're going to ask the second question: is God willing/able to make papal infallibility happen? Is he willing/able to ensure that the primatial leader of the true church is divinely protected from ever binding the faithful to error? Like it said, I was told that on one occasion, a pope was about to proclaim a heresy, and he woke up dead, as the saying goes, the next day. Or like on another occasion, he just changed his mind and couldn't explain why. I mean, these kinds of things. I mean, it seems like, how to put it? At the very least, the idea that God could do this doesn't seem to be intrinsically logically contradictory, like making a square circle. I guess we can't be certain that he would, but it does seem like it's at least conceivable that he could. Christianity is the world's most dominant religion, and that fact is either providence or a coincidence. And if it's providence, we can suppose that God is willing and able to use his power in whatever form that actually takes. Sometimes that looks like loving your enemies and martyrdom, but ideally should always look like that, really. At least, the loving your enemies part, hopefully not martyrdom, but, God give us the grace to do that if we should need to. But we see from the dominance of Christianity, unless it's a coincidence, that God is willing and able to flex a certain amount of providential muscle. Again, this idea doesn't have any logical contradictions. So I think that the more motivation we have to believe in the A proposition, that essentially it would, the matter of finding the true church wouldn't all fall on the shoulders of the individual and force them to basically study every issue they can think of as intensively as they can, forever, as a function of having any reliable, hope of finding the true church. I think, there's sufficient motivation that God wouldn't have let it all rest on personal theological acumen, that we can that we can suppose papal infallibility, likely, to the extent that we have motivation for the A proposition. So again, what is the motivation for the A proposition? The mind-numbing realities of determining the positive theological picture, which is the only principled basis one can have for being affiliated with any particular communion or confession. True submission on the basis of authority is not really possible. It's more so conditional and subject to one's own verification, trust but verify, as the saying goes. Let me see, Christianity is a religion that places a great premium on submission. So to the extent that any sort of assumption makes submission like a priori impossible, that should cause us to rethink that assumption. In this case, the assumption of papal fallibility seems to make personal theological acumen and personal verification, on the basis of facts and one's ability to see the truth of those facts for oneself, the rule of the day in a way that's sort of problematic in a religion that says, don't lean on your own understanding. For motivation, we also have what I call the three warehouses thought experiment. And it's sort of like the thought experiment that we initially considered. It systematically manipulates variables of theological difficulty and theological importance. It considers three cases: one in which theology is neither difficult nor important, one in which it is important but not difficult, and another in which it is important and difficult. And it observes that, interestingly, in the case where it's both difficult and important, the motivation to believe someone on the basis of sort of who he is and what he claims to know, rather than what you can discern for yourself, rises in an interesting way. And I think it's a way that sort of generalizes to our case, the case of theism / Christianity. So in the first condition, it's like a reality TV show challenge, maybe, where 20 people go to a warehouse. The task is to make some art. Art has no right or wrong. It just has to express something inside you. A strange character in the 20 who in the group that might be a plant from the show or might just be crazy, tells them that he has a special relationship with the warehouse owner, where if he ever makes his statue or his sculpture wrong in any way, the owner will buzz him and let him know. And given that there's no real wrong way to make art, his claims sound a little bit hard to believe, and people just ignore him and make whatever they want rather than patterning their sculpture after his. And the second condition, 20 people go to a warehouse, different people, different warehouse. The task is to make a boat that will be paddled over a calm lake. All the boat really has to be is watertight. There's plenty of supplies to make boats. A strange character again speaks up and says that if you follow his example, you'll be sure to make a boat that is correct, that it doesn't have any flaws in its design. And the people don't really know whether to believe him or not, so they just go off and make their own boats. They essentially weighed the likelihood that the man was telling the truth against the likelihood that they could make a boat safely on their own, and they decided that the likelihood of their being able to make a boat on their own was high enough that they didn't really have to pay attention to that man. And I don't think they were wrong, hypothetically, to draw that conclusion. Now, in the third condition, we have a condition like the one that we first considered. People are building an aircraft, and not only is it an aircraft, it's some kind of weird, almost like alien aircraft that even a regular aeronautics background won't give you any solid assurance of being able to understand. Your options are you either follow the instructions in the manual to the best of your ability, or pattern your aircraft after somebody who you think is doing a better job than you. But again, your assessment of whether he's doing a better job than you ultimately can only rest on your own understanding of the manual, because no one has seen one of these things before. And then in this case, a strange character speaks up and says, hey, if you pattern your aircraft after mine, it will be guaranteed to be totally safe because of who I know and because of, who I am. And the thing is, his credibility rises significantly in this case because it's something that is too difficult, and it's something that's too important to gamble on, and something that's too difficult for you to do on your own. So assuming that the thing is doable, assuming that it's doable to make the aircraft, this is almost certainly the only way it could be made, because if it's resting on your own ability to understand the manual, you're almost certainly going to crash. So this is illustrating that the logic of theism makes the likelihood of a sort of external infallible guide more likely. It makes it increases it. Why? Because theism assumes that where God wants us to do something, he creates a way for us to do something. If it's too difficult for us to do ourselves, it means that he has made a provision for us to do it. And there's also really a certain sense in which one feels God would have failed us or let us down if there is not a reliable way to find the true church. Prior to the primatial leader's hypothetical descent into his first definite theological error, there was this beautifully brainless method of finding the true church. All you had to do was submit if you didn't know. If you didn't know, you could just say, well, I don't know the answer to the filioque and whether it's right to split the church over it or not, assuming that was the true reason why the church split. I believe that God is steering this ship. So if you believe that, you ought to believe that trusting your ecclesial superior, the highest one, will help you. In the case of the Eastern Orthodox, certainly by the time of Florence, it looked rather like the people were disagreeing with the bishops. When the bishops came back from Florence saying this is what we've agreed on, and the people were like, we don't accept this theology. But if and did they have political reasons for that? That's contentious. It looks to me like they did, but an Eastern Orthodox might say they both had political and theological reasons for that, and I don't want to beg the question against that, but I'm just saying in that case, it doesn't really look like they were deferring to their authorities. But, if you have trust in God and you trust that you yourself can't figure the issues out, I think it makes sense to defer to the authority. And to the extent that there's not a way to find the true church reliably, it looks like God isn't showing up for us. There's that inevitable sense. And also that there's a sense that the church breaks at the point where you can no longer just blindly trust the authorities. But now the only way that you can find the truth is by trusting to your own judgment. It seems like something breaks, because before the primatial leader fell into error, you didn't have to trust to your own judgment, but after he does, you have to. It's like the church loses something. Yes, and the third, I'm talking here about a movie scene in Inception where Ken Watanabe's character tells Leonardo DiCaprio's character that, I, Ken Watanabe, can do the thing that you so desperately need to get done. And Leonardo DiCaprio is like, I'm going to need a guarantee. How do I know you can? And Ken Watanabe says, you don't, but I can, and I'm your only hope. So it kind of feels that way with the strange character in the third warehouse condition. And it really feels like the reason why he becomes somebody that we throw in our lot with, even if only out of desperation, is because the stakes have gone up. Theology, it seems like he becomes more credible the more difficult and yet the more important theology is. Is the analogy disanalogous? I don't think so. I think, if anything, it's even harder and more important to get all of theology right, or at least to try to get all of theology right. Trusting, that God is merciful, it doesn't excuse you from trying or taking the matter seriously. All right, so let's get into some propositions here. O says that God's omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence are such that God will have ensured in every age there was, is, and will always be a reliable way for a majority of believers, if not all believers, to find the true church. Now, there's good reason to believe this a priori, but if we just assume it, it begs the question against non-Catholicism like immediately, because arguably the only way that a majority of believers have a way of reliably finding the true church, i.e. just by submitting to their ultimate ecclesial superior, is that's only true if Catholicism is true, because Catholicism is about half of believers, and that's a majority under some understanding of the word majority. So if we assume it just begs the question, however much a priori motivation there might be for it. But O star seems more charitable. It says God's omni-ness is at least such that he would have never allowed it to be the case that only a tiny minority of believers could find the true church reliably. And that appears to be our case, unfortunately. Like, the minimal fact set challenge isn't necessarily showing that no one has justified true belief based on the first order theology. But I think it is showing that if there is anyone who does, the number of people who really have justified true belief is actually quite low. Everybody else is sort of right, but for the wrong reasons, or for half-baked reasons. Now, A star is a lot like A, but it's a little bit more a priori. It's a little bit more agnostic on how the non-personal theological acumen-based way of finding the true church can come about. It doesn't necessarily say that there will always be a trustworthy authority, in place of having to rely on one's own judgment. Although, at the same time, one wonders what the only possible logical alternative is to believing something based on your own observation and judgment. Besides, trusting the authority of another. But anyway, A star simply says that given the difficulty of theology, we may suppose that God in his omniness never either positively willed or passively allowed finding the true church to become dependent on theological acumen, but rather ensured there would always, that is in every age, be some other reliable way of finding the true church that was relatively brainless, and not making any specifications on what that was. But let me see. Yeah, I think I said that, as far as I can tell, the three warehouses thought experiment is relevant. It's actually, if it's disanalogous, it's because it doesn't show theology as being important enough or sufficiently difficult. I think it's more difficult and more important than even building some kind of strange novel aircraft out of a kit. Let me see. Yeah, and this, it's sort of, there's no real limit to how important we can imagine theology to be, nor does there appear to be any real limit on how important we should imagine it to be. Again, theology being something that either bears on one's eternal destination, in which case it seems to have infinite importance, or it does not, in which case it doesn't appear to have any importance at all, and in fact seems like something that should be avoided. And as far as I know, the more just we lean into at least the idea that theology should be treated by the believer as something of the highest importance, even if one understands there are limits on one's ability to do all of theology correctly, nevertheless, you shouldn't just presume God's mercy and be lazy and presume his mercy. You should try your hardest and treat it with the importance that it deserves. Should take it more seriously than, building an aircraft on which even your own physical life would depend. Let me see. So yeah, as far as I can tell, or at least it's hard for me to see the argument that you shouldn't. take theology that seriously. And the Three Warehouses thought experiment can sort of increase the motivation for this A-star thesis without limit. Plus, it's a bunch of Bible verses that continually tend to downplay the importance or the value of worldly wisdom and leaning on one's own understanding, and instead suggest that the kingdom and the truths of God, are revealed only to those who are submissive, like a child. And, God knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are useless. It would be strange if it turned out that really the only way to find the true church reliably was through earthly wisdom, earthly intelligence, earthly education. It would also, again, as I said, feel like a failure, like something that wasn't God's positive will, but something that only happened, an evil that only happened through his permissive will. Let me see. Yeah. On non-Catholicism, the best case scenario is that God, in his permissive will, allowed the true church to be discoverable reliably only by the most educated and intelligent, and maybe even then not even by them, because there doesn't really seem to be a correlation among the very smartest or very most knowledgeable Christians as to what denomination they end up in. I could be wrong about that. Maybe there is one, and maybe it's strong enough that it's not just chance, or couldn't just be attributed to chance. Now, if it turned out there was a predilection for them to end up Catholic, that would, be bad for non-Catholicism. But, maybe there's one where, past a certain IQ level, they're just all Presbyterian. That would be interesting. I'm open to that possibility. But as far as I know, that's not the case. I don't have any reason to believe that there is any correlation, even among the highest echelons of, the Christian intellectual elite, as far as where they tend to end up. And that really suggests that your chances of finding the true church do not go up as a function of how smart or educated you are, or how much time you put into studying the question. That would be kind of gloomy, because it's suggesting there's no real relationship between the level of effort that you put into the question and the accuracy of your resulting guess. It would be like trying to win the lottery, where you're only allowed to buy one ticket. You can't really try to win the lottery just by holding one ticket in your hand and staring at it. So I mean, the best case scenario is there is a relationship at the highest levels between intelligence and education and your ability to find the true church. And that, it wasn't God's positive will, but it did happen through his permissive will. His positive will was darn it, the primatial leaders should have stayed, pious, and he should have stayed theologically accurate, but he just didn't. But that's not God's fault. We can't pin it on God. But even though theoretically, probably it's within the scope of his providence that he could have prevented something like that happening, or at least we don't know that his providence, we don't know that God is unable to providentially prevent something like that from happening. But, at the same time, granted, it's not every conceivable good thing that God can do that he does do. He could get rid of all cancer, but he hasn't done that. So, there are some mysteries. There are some evils that happen for mysterious reasons. So I'm just making room for that possibility. But the best case scenario on non-Catholicism is that God, in his permissive will, allowed the true church to be discoverable reliably only by the most educated and intelligent, which is really contrary to every message we get in Scripture. You might say, again, we're talking about how if you say you find it by being pious and humble, you just have to be prepared to say that the reason why so-and-so's not in your church is that he's less pious and humble than you, And like, if you see someone more humble and pious than yourself in a different church, do you have to go join their church? But then you're confronted by the fact that you just see someone more humble and pious than you in like every single church. So it's like, which one is it? Anyway, I don't think it really works to try to make that be the way that you find the church. I don't really know of a better way than just trying to figure out for yourself based on personal theological study which church has all correct theology, if Catholicism is not true. So let me see. Yeah, there's some more motivation for the papacy, which is that it turns out to be load-bearing. If you remove primatial reliability from the equation, you can't really easily answer questions like, why does your canon have the books that it does? What councils do you accept? Why these particular councils? What is the process for determining what a valid council is? One might say the Eastern Orthodox, they can say why their canon is what it is, because they believe in a source of authority beyond the scripture. Yet, my understanding is the canon actually varies from communion to communion within Eastern Orthodoxy, as it does within Oriental Orthodoxy, because the Ethiopian Orthodox have the most books in their canon, is my understanding. Let me see. I'm just noting here that a thesis like A star, that there's always going to be some way to find the true church that doesn't depend on personal theological acumen, or command of the relevant issues, like a sort of a brainless way. That seems to be not quite biconditionally related to Catholicism, but just about. Like, it's true if Catholicism is true and vice versa. There's wrinkles to this I won't get into, but basically it's like a thesis like A star says that here are some reasons. There will always be a brainless way to find the true church because reasons. Now, Catholicism could be true, which would mean there is a brainless way to find the true church, so to speak. I'm using brainless here, sort of jokingly, but it's very simple. It's foolproof, but that A star says that foolproof method is there for certain reasons. Those reasons might not be the reasons why the foolproof method is there. So that's why I'm hesitant to say there's a fully biconditional relationship between Catholicism and the A star thesis, but we can basically, for our purposes, assume there is one, which has important ramifications later. So I have a formula here that tells you basically whether you should be Catholic or not in order to maximize your chances of being in the true church. So P of A star, the probability of A star is the probability both that A star is true and that you find the true church by being in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And I think this is safe to conflate these two, because if A star is true, the probability of finding the true church by being in communion with Rome is 100%. Because if A star is true, then Catholicism is true, basically. A star times 1.0 is A star, but this critically assumes that communion with the Bishop of Rome is the real world mechanism that corresponds to A star. A pretty safe assumption, because I don't know what other sort of brainless or non-theological way there is to find the true church, besides being in communion with the Bishop of Rome, even assuming the truth of some other non-Catholic position. So Yeah, let the probability of not A star be the probability that A star is not true for our purposes here. A star not being true means that the normative way to find the true church is through personal theological acumen, whether as a function of God's positive will or just his permissive will, since the mechanism of primatial reliability broke. And I don't think we need to worry about the probability of O star. It's not really going to come up. Let the probability of D equal the likelihood that one is able to find the true church through personal theological acumen and or by chance, if A star is not true. Note that if A star is not true, then for all intents and purposes, Catholicism is not true, since Catholicism implies there will always be some way to find the true church other than personal theological acumen. So if there's not some way to find the true church other than personal theological acumen, then Catholicism is false. So since D is the probability of one's finding the true church if A star is not true, D is also, in effect, the probability that one will find the true church if Catholicism is not true. Hence, by implication, D is the probability that one finds the true non-Catholic church. Assuming that that either the Catholic Church or one of the non-Catholic churches is the true church. So we have this formula. If P of A star exceeds the joint probability of not A star and D, then you should be Catholic. It should be noted that since this formula requires the joint probability of not A star and D to exceed A for rejecting Catholicism to be preferable, the probability of A star will tend to exceed the joint probability of not A star and D, given even relatively low probabilities of A star, and given even what would appear to be very generous probabilities of D, at least in light of the minimal fact set problem. Or at least where we assume being in the true church to mean being right about everything, or being right at a minimum about every single no. You basically just have to be right about everything, or at least be right about most things, many things, at least where we assume being in the true church to mean being right to a high level of sort of theological specificity, assuming that it matters to be correct with that level of precision. Now, from the outset, we can also appreciate that the probability of A star, that if it ever rises above 50%, then Catholicism is favored to maximize one's chances of being in the true church, whatever probability we give to D, which I really think should always be a low probability. If it was the case that we could find a tendency among the very smartest and most educated Christians to be in a particular church, and I mean a really strong tendency that couldn't just be attributable to chance, then we could say that, D is low for the average person, but it increases the more intelligent and educated you are. Except I don't really see any grounds for saying that its chances, that the likelihood of D actually increases the more intelligent and educated you are. I think D should always be low, say like 1%. If you're talking about getting everything right, I think even that's too generous. Now, of course, what are your chances of being right enough based on your own personal theological acumen? That is an obviously a trickier question, but we will talk about that too. For example, if the probability of A star is 51%, then the probability of not A star and D is 49%, even if the probability of D is stipulated to be 100%. So this is just math. A joint probability means we're multiplying the probability of not A star and D, at least that's my understanding, that the probability that both of those are true is the probability of each one times the other. And the probability of not A star is always going to be 1 minus the probability of A star. And so, there's a way that based on the math of that, if A star ever gets above 50%, it's just game over, no matter what. And what is the prior probability of A star? I think it should be high because, again, I just don't see that God would ever let finding the true church reliably be a matter of you getting all the theology right yourself. So I've just give different examples, and I show that basically wherever D and A star have the same probability, the math says you should favor being in the Catholic Church, even if it only increases your chance of being in the right church by 1%. It's like if you win a race by a nose, you still win definitively if the camera shows that you did indeed win by a nose. It's cateris paribus. It's all else equal. Catholicism has the edge wherever we give equal probabilities to A star and D. Really, I think A star should have a higher probability and D should have a much lower one. And so if we give D a realistic 1% probability, then even if you give A star a very unrealistic 1% probability, Catholicism is still preferable as a way to maximize your chances of being in the true church. Because what I'm saying is simply, it's not enough to simply assess what your chances of finding the true church would be if non-Catholicism is true. You have to basically say, what are the chances that I find the true church what are the chances that I find the true non-Catholic church using personal theological acumen, and that there is just no way to find it besides personal theological acumen, which seems unlikely for a priori reasons. If there is a way to find it besides personal theological acumen, that basically entitles us to conclude that Catholicism is true. So whatever probability we assign to the possibility that there could be a way to find the true church that isn't solely based on personal theological acumen, is a probability that we basically have to reserve for Catholicism being true. So as long as you're very confident that personal theological acumen is like the only way it can / should be done, then you can go ahead and let the assessment of the likelihood of your finding the true church, be a matter of just finding out, what are your own chances of finding the true church through personal theological acumen, assuming like you feel lucky, if you think that you're especially smart or educated or something. I don't know if this ever really replicated, but they used to talk about the Dunning-Kruger effect. Sometimes people are confident because they don't actually know how little they really know. But again, I would suggest, as far as I can tell, based on the minimal fact set problem, and they're not really seeming to be a correlation among the very best and brightest as far as what church they end up in. I don't think your chances of finding the true church actually do go up under any circumstances. I'm not sure there's anything you can do to raise your chances of finding it based on personal theological acumen. I think everyone is basically just guessing. Could be wrong, let me see. Let us calculate the probability of D, where the probability of D means the probability of finding some acceptably correct alternative to the Catholic Church, assuming that the Catholic Church is not the true church. It should be noted that there are many different ways of conceptualizing what might constitute an acceptably correct alternative to Catholicism, assuming that Catholicism is false, since one's judgment as to which church or churches are more correct than the Catholic Church will ultimately depend on one's positive conception of theology, or one's best guess as to what the fullness of correct theology is. For example, if you are Protestant, then you might consider the Eastern Orthodox Church, hereafter EO, or the Oriental Orthodox Church, hereafter OO, or the Assyrian Church of the East, hereafter AE, to be about equally problematic as Catholicism. If we further assume that every Protestant denomination is acceptably correct, a generous assumption since few, if any, Protestants would ever be likely to assume this, and assume a chance of finding the true church through personal theological acumen, or by chance, equal to Protestantism's percentage share of the world's non-Catholic population, which let's assume to be 80%, then the probability of D rises to a muscular 80%, even if you assume someone is just picking at random among the non-Catholic denominations. So that would seem like something, this kind of objection seems like it could undo the force of my argument. I mean, granted, A star is pretty. I think there are good grounds to say it has a high prior probability. If its probability is also 80%, then the Catholicism will have the edge. Any of the other non-Catholic churches, EO, OO, or AE, have a much smaller percentage share of the world's Christian population, so the picture only looks worse for them. But this does raise the question of sort of what acceptably correct is. There's a wrinkle in this. Let me see if I can explain this. If you say that all you have to get right is, a certain restricted set of core issues, and beyond that, it doesn't matter if you're right or not. There's two ways one could mean that. I mean, one way is let me put it like this. You could say the only issues that matter are a certain restricted set of core issues. Let's say the Trinity, divino-human Christology, and biblical inspiration or something like that. Or the 66 that the Bible has at least the 66 books that everyone pretty much agrees it has. Let's say those are the core issues. Those are the only ones that actually matter to get right. There's two ways you can mean that. One way you could mean it is these are truly the only important issues. Everything else is unimportant, and it's actually a distraction. It has like no bearing on your eternal destination. You need to actively get away from it. The fullness of correct theology is then something where you only focus on those issues and ignore everything else. Now, how do you know that only these issues are important? The only way I assume you could know is if you actually investigate every single issue and then thereby decide how important it is and, give it the appropriate evaluation of importance. How easy is that to do? What are the cognitive costs associated with that? I would assume they're about as high as going into every single issue and trying to be right about every single issue. But, I don't really know. You could just assume a certain criterion of, theology such that, only a few things are important, but I don't know where you would really get off assuming that only certain things matter. It's like we want to be principled about this and be careful, because if we don't really know that these things don't matter, all we're doing is sort of advertising a certain willingness to gamble on something we shouldn't be willing to gamble about. We should at least try not to gamble about, and not just, lazily gamble about and presume God's mercy. Yes. So, I mean, you can mean it in a sort of a strict way. And then, as far as I know, the only way you could, ensure that you were correct, that only these issues matter, is if you just go out and weigh everything, which is about as hard to do as, it is to be right about everything, I think. Let me see. Or you can assume that, I guess you could just assume that it's truly safe to have a position on the non-essentials, and safe not to have a position on the non-essentials. You can assume that. The thing of it is that, and let me pull my slides back up, is we have to ask, how do we know that it is safe to have a position on the essentials and not to have one? This is like asking, Protestants say the main things are the plain things, but the question of which things are main is itself not plain, right? So the question is, how do you know what actually matters and what doesn't? Again, how does one obtain the answer to that without systematically investigating every issue? That's the only way you can be safe. In other words, I don't think this kind of response actually gets you out of the dilemma of having to investigate every theological question for yourself in the limit if papal infallibility isn't true. Yeah. Let me see. All right. So, I think that actually does a decent job of addressing that. We can't really be confident about what issues do and don't matter and what it's safe to have a position on or not have a position on, or what it's safe to have an incorrect position on. We can't be confident about all this unless we do exactly the kind of systematic and comprehensive study that we are trying to say is unnecessary. That's kind of what I see as the problem with that response. It would also just assume a rather casual attitude on God's part toward theology. He just doesn't really. It's not a thing that matters so much. It would, in the limit, this kind of objection would just be to say that it doesn't matter to find the true church, except with respect to these three core issues. And it's oh geez, how did you figure that? It's a hard calculation to compute. It's that's non-obvious, right? To really follow that person's math and check it would be a laborious process, and far from, it would be far from guaranteed to result in a correct answer. All right. So here's a complication. Basically, it's kind of okay, let me just read this. The probability of A star and the probability of the joint probability of not A star and D are not independent probabilities, but are negatively related to each other, since, for all intents and purposes, A star and Catholicism are synonymous. So it's saying that basically you could, if you can show that some non-Catholic church is true with high probability, that's like a priori reducing the probability that A star is true, because A star is really only true if Catholicism is true. And so it's like your prior probability for A star has to be adjusted in light of D. And let me explain this. Let me see if I can do this justice. If hypothetically one could know with high probability that a certain collection of theological facts indicated a particular non-Catholic church with high probability, that would significantly increase the probability of D. That is, of one's finding the true church through personal theological acumen. Since Eastern Orthodoxy and Catholicism are mutually exclusive, that would in turn reduce the probability of A star, at least by some degree or other. And certainly the higher A star is, the more the joint probability of not A star and D goes down, because not A star just goes down, the higher A star goes up. So there's between the two terms on either side of the inequality sign, there is this kind of obvious inverse relationship, but it's also like a kind of tricky, like interdependence, like you can't really decide the one without deciding the other and vice versa. And that's almost like, at a global level, the disjunctive argument is saying if theology is indeterminate, sort of at the first order level, then that itself represents a decisive second order case for Catholicism at the second order level. But that's only if it is, like, as it were, determinately indeterminate at the first order level. This is threatening to make it indeterminately indeterminate. Like, we don't even know if theology is indeterminate or not, which I already did sort of address that with my epistemological considerations, and saying it's not that I claim to know that it's indeterminate, as that I'm just going to assume it is until I have reason to believe otherwise. So I think I have sort of partially addressed it with that. But yeah, the relationship between those two things, well, let me see. Yeah, I guess, yeah, the response I would make to that is just what I said in the epistemological considerations slide. And this is where I talk about how the best way to demotivate A would be to make a negative case against Catholicism, which is a simpler hypothesis than a positive case for a non-Catholic church. But even then, the weakness of it is that it makes very particular assumptions about, like, for example, how the magisterium is supposed to work, how certain statements should be interpreted or can be interpreted. It makes particular assumptions about whether those statements are indeed, like, uttered at a register of doctrinal infallibility, or if they're not necessarily infallible. Again, given that theology should at least be treated by us, I would contend, as a space with many possibilities, I just don't see that we are justified in acting as though there are only a few ways that all of Catholic teaching could be held together. I think we should see that there are many ways, or we should act as if there are many, many possible ways. And the motivation to find a harmonizing way, as with the Bible and scriptural contradictions, for example, is going to go up the more sort of motivation we have for Catholicism in the form of, like, A star, which can be motivated, as I showed, a lot, by different thought experiments and just by different considerations. Yep. Let me see. Yeah. Another reason to assume A star is, as I think I said, not assuming A star seems to reflect a very limited view of God's omni-ness in his ability to act in the world, and or a rather casual attitude on his part toward theological accuracy, since not a star inevitably means most people are guessing, and even those whose guess is mostly correct, quote unquote, whatever that may exactly mean, or whose guess is at least more correct than the Catholic position, will still in all likelihood shoulder a large burden of theological inaccuracy. The number of people who get everything right is going to be very, very slim, even if a lot of people get quote unquote enough right. Whereas, what's interesting is that if Catholicism is true, then it's as if how to put it, it's more compatible with the idea that A, theology is very important, and B, God is providentially ensuring that the fullness of correct theology is sort of maximized with regard to geographic and temporal spread, because everyone who's Catholic, at least theoretically, believes like all of Catholic doctrine, even if they don't know where it is. They at least have true belief in all of Catholic doctrine, which is defined to a relatively high level of theological specificity. In other words, if I say that Protestantism is right, the number of people who actually got all the theological questions right in Protestantism, let's say the Presbyterians, that's a small subset of Protestants. But if I say that Catholicism is right, then the number of Catholics who got all of the questions right is basically, it's all Catholics, theoretically. I mean, it's not like every Catholic studies all the questions, but at the same time, they know where to look for the answers. They know to look in the catechism. So they have true belief in where it is, which is not nothing. All right. So yeah, I showed why I'm not really buying the negative case against Catholicism. Let me see. I think I did talk about this enough. Yeah. Yeah, so, in the end, a given negative case against Catholicism is only going to succeed if we accept its particular magisterial or papal or conciliar assumptions, or a given positive case for a non-Catholic church is only going to succeed if we accept its particular assumptions. But where is the motivation to assume these very specific assumptions that are far from necessarily true? The more specific one's theories are, the higher is the likelihood that they're false. The only thing that would enable such arguments to succeed decisively would be a suitably high degree of motivation for their assumptions. But, I'm not sure what that could look like. In Catholicism, the motivation is there is a great benefit to God's people that would be realized if Catholicism was true. A way of finding the true church that doesn't rely on personal theological acumen. But I'm not aware of any a priori special benefits for the people of God that would attend on, for example, Eastern Orthodoxy or Protestantism. All those would do would be to impose an obligation on God's people to construct some kind of involved case just to be able to identify the true church with any measure of confidence in the aftermath of the primatial fall. Let me see. No. Okay, we did talk about this. We talked about sort of, the way that we talked about the analogy between papal infallibility and Proverbs 3:6, I think in a satisfactory way. The question before us is not whether there exists some way of claiming personal ignorance or incompetence that avoids all conceivable charges of self-referential inconsistency, as in the paradox of knowing that you know nothing. Because if you know that you know nothing, then it's like you know something, right? So that's a paradox. But it's not, is there some way to claim ignorance that avoids all possible charges of paradox? But is there a meaningful difference between judging yourself incompetent to judge the theological facts on the ground? In other words, is the nature of our situation such that it's more humble and realistic to make that judgment? Between that and judging yourself competent to judge any or all or enough, quote unquote, of the theological facts on the ground. There's a difference between those two types of judgment. Any objection that glosses over that difference is about as misguided as the atheist's objection to Proverbs 3:6 would be. Talked about the epistemological considerations. Now, this argument, here's the thing. It's one thing to try to convince somebody who's not Catholic to be Catholic. Might not be hard if that person doesn't have staked out views on different theological issues, but it might be very hard if they do. And no matter sort of how well-reasoned the presentation is, I wouldn't consider its chances of changing, a non-Catholic's mind to be super high. Just by itself. I mean, it might plant a seed or get the ball rolling, but, like they say, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. And that's assuming everything I've said is correct and it doesn't contain some kind of fatal flaw or fallacy, which if it does, please point that out to me. But see, the thing is, there is utility in this argument in as much as it provides me a principled basis for remaining Catholic, and it also kind of shows me under what conditions I should think about like a jumping ship. If I think that the chances of Catholicism are sufficiently of Catholicism being true are sufficiently low, and my chances of finding the true church if Catholicism is not true, that is based on my own personal theological acumen, if those are sufficiently high, then you can do the math and it'll tell you, whether you should, it'll give you some kind of principled basis for whether you should stay or go. But the other thing is, I really think this argument, it works well as a defense. Like this argument from here on out, I foresee it being my sort of go-to response in the face of any non-Catholic challenge, positive or negative. Because whether it be, in other words, whether it be a case for some non-Catholic church or a case against the Catholic Church in particular, because I see the resolution to the debate, between two positions as occurring at the level of the assumptions that underpin those two positions. It's all going to come down to whose assumptions we have greater reason to trust in. And for my part, as I've said, it seems to me that the assumptions beneath any particular non-Catholic argument tend to be somewhat arbitrary, ultimately. And it's almost like they have to be because of what I call the criterial regress problem. Whereas the assumption that God's omni-ness is such that he wouldn't let finding the true church reliably rest entirely on, or, in maintaining doctrinal orthodoxy, rest entirely on each believer's capacity to determine all of theology for themselves. And that anyone who can't do that is just forced to gamble and guess as to their as to which church is the true church, which theoretically has some relevance to their chances of salvation. Otherwise, how is it important at all? Not neglecting God's mercy, but again, I'm saying that it's really hard to see why we shouldn't at least try to take this as seriously as we can, right? Let me see. So yeah, it's hard for me to imagine a situation where a non-Catholic case would come along and the assumptions would genuinely have more force than something like A star, you know, they could just like, the non-Catholic could just like assign a prior probability to their assumptions that was greater than or equal to A star, but that would be arbitrary unless they could actually do the work of showing how those assumptions are motivated, you know, like on independent or non-circular grounds. You can't say like, you know, sola scriptura is true because Presbyterianism is true, and then Presbyterianism is true because sola scriptura is true. You can't go be circular, right? You have to have like some kind of independent or a priori way of motivating your assumptions. So it's time to address some objections. Let me take a quick break before we do that.